And George Will, on behalf of the Institute for Humane Studies, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, the Conservative Sensibility is a very full work. It weighs in at 538 pages of text. In the world of political philosophy, that's not an especially rare feat, but what is rare is when you find a book of this length and depth in which every single word counts. So just let me begin with this note of appreciation for the discipline and concision you bring to your craft.
Well, thank you. I'm taught to think in 750-word chunks after 40-some years as a columnist.
I think that's a discipline that makes one a good writer.
Well, concision is not an option. It's a necessity.
So in that spirit, I'd like to focus in on one sentence that appears early in the book and really kind of unpack it, because I think there's a lot in it. You describe the American conservative sensibility as a perpetually unfolding response to real situations that require statesmanship, the application of general principles to untidy realities. So let's begin with the phrase American conservative. What work is that modifier American doing, and what is it that conservatives are attempting to conserve?
Well, conservatism in Europe became conscious of itself with Edmund Burke, and in general is a reaction against change, particularly the French Revolution, that had been comprehensive in intent, abrupt in methods, and disappointing in results. So Burke made the case for suspicion of grand political ventures and the law of unintended consequences, which always attends those. The law being, of course, that the unintended consequences of vast interventions in complex societies are often larger than and contrary to the intended consequences. When conservatism crossed the United States and got rechristened, as it were, conservatism became an embrace of change. It's been said that the story of the Bible reduced to one sentence is God created man and woman and promptly lost control of events. American conservatives say, good, we don't want events controlled. That's the source of many of the problems of the world. There is, however, an intersection between the Burke conservatism and the American conservatism, and it is this. When Burke said that these vast attempts to remake society, have comprehensive plans for a new society, were doomed to fail, he did not use the phrase, but could have used the phrase, they are guilty of the fatal conceit. And the fatal conceit, of course, is the phrase from Friedrich Hayek, who warned against the fatal conceit of assuming that we can know more than we actually can know, and hence that we can control more than we actually can control. So there is a considerable tangent between European conservatism and American conservatism in that particular way. When I use the word sensibility, I mean more than an attitude, but less than an agenda. Because agendas have to be shaped by prudence, by adapting to situations we did not will and cannot control. So it requires flexibility, requires the kind of statesmanship that I think Lincoln exemplified, because Lincoln had to maneuver within a very complex American setting, full of beliefs that he found A, unattractive, but B, durable. And therefore he had to maneuver around them. Maneuver being, I think, perhaps the central word for prudent conservatism.
So let me dive into that word sensibility here a bit. So the sensibility being not quite an agenda, but a posture, or at least in part an attitude. What is that attitude? What is there's one of the things you say in the book is that you see the conservative sensibility as possessing a sort of wholesome skepticism of power, for example. Now, I look at the world today and I see a lot of cynicism, a lot of snark. And so I think that one might describe this as a kind of skepticism of power. But I'm wondering if you see those two things in parallel, or if there's some important distinction between cynicism on the one hand and a wholesome skepticism of power on the other.
Cynicism, famously described as knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. That's not cynicism that I'm talking about. I'm talking about realism. For example, to take a very current example, the current president speaks, and those of his utmost ardent supporters constantly speak of transforming the United States, as though the United States were a construct of tinker toys to be pulled apart and reassembled at will. The great viscosity of society, its wholesome, often saving inertia, has to be respected. It has to be not deplored. It has to be understood to be a wholesome impediment to the willfulness of the ever-changing political class with its ever-changing agendas. That's what I mean by a sensibility. It's a kind of general recoil against the vocabulary of overreaching, because the vocabulary of overreaching is usually the precursor to overreaching.
So let's think also about the populist sentiments that this attitude adopts. If we have real passion amongst the vast numbers of a society, that they want something transformational, as you just described. You described the conservative sensibility as something that sort of tamps that down, that intentionally filters that populist passion. Does that suggest that the conservative sensibility is an elite sensibility?
Yes. Yes. The question.
Want to defend that?
Of course. The question in any society at any time is not whether elites shall rule, but which elites shall rule. And the challenge to democracy is to win consent to worthy elites. When the public says, or some large portion of the public says, we want transformation, fundamental reordering of society, it's fair to say, A, you probably don't, because you don't know what that entails, both in measures taken and, again, unintended consequences. And B, even if you do want it, you can't have it. There is an entire structure of our government, the constitutional architecture that Madison and others bequeathed to us, plus a properly engaged judiciary, exists to give us what Madison called, in a lovely phrase, mitigated democracy. That is democracy that is slowed down, that is governed by what Greg Weiner, in a great book of his with this title, called Madison's metronome, the attempt to give change time to breathe, time to be thoughtful, time to be reflective, time to be chastened and changed on the way to implementation. So if people want radical fundamental change, the chances are there are political, institutional, and constitutional impediments to that, all of which are worthwhile and not to be lightly jettisoned.
So I want to unpack that phrase "worthy elites" for a moment. One of the authors that I think is really important in the current context is Martin Gurry's work, where he's talking about the democratization, the radical democratization of information that we have had over the last decade. And there are many, many wonderful things that come with that. And yet also one of the things that he laments is that it becomes much easier to tear down, to break down elite structures that served a valuable purpose. So a principal example that he would use would be the rules of the game for journalists, that it used to be that we would go to some standard venues for what was happening in the world, and that was kind of a kind of set of guardrails that allowed us to kind of know what was going on in the world, and there were certain principles that we trusted the journalists would follow, and that there's been a radical democratization and breaking up of that elite structure. Again, some of which is good, but he also says that there's a real problem here. Is that a similar point that you're making in terms of describing the conservative sensibility as an elite sensibility?
Yes. First of all, there is an abundance of information in a society in which everyone now has a supercomputer in his pocket or her purse. So we have this Niagara of information, and we tend to think information is a synonym for knowledge, which it's not. It can be essential to knowledge, it can be knowledge, but it is not necessarily knowledge. It can be just data, just information. In fact, it seems to me that the biggest challenge America faces at the moment is to create elites who actually believe in their country. We have a higher education system now that is dominated, particularly in the liberal arts, not in the STEM sciences, because if they were woke, the bridges would fall down. They actually have to know things. But we have in the liberal arts portion of our higher education, which begs the question, higher than what exactly? But in the liberal arts section, there is a feeling that what traditionally was considered the fundamental, not the exhaustive, but the fundamental task of education was transmission of the best that had been thought and said over the ages, to use Matthew Arnold's phrase. Today, it's not transmission, it is indoctrination. It is to set people into an adversarial stance against the society into which they will be graduating. A nation that cannot replenish its elites with other elites who are fundamentally devoted to the wisdom of their nation's founding principles and the general goodness of the country for all its flaws and disagreeable events in its past. A nation that can't replicate such an elite is not going to be a great nation, or perhaps even a nation, for very long.
And one of the things that you want these worthy elites to do is to apply general principles, going back to that opening sentence. So applying general principles. What are some of those principles? Give us some examples of those principles, and why general principles as opposed to known concrete ends?
Well, let's set up the argument that exists in my book between two Princetonians. James Madison of the class of 1774 and Woodrow Wilson, Tommy as he was known, Thomas Woodrow Wilson at Princeton of the class of 1879. Woodrow Wilson, the first American president to criticize the American founding, did not do so peripherally, but root and branch. And he rejected the Madisonian architecture that flowed from the Madisonian and the founders' natural rights doctrine. The founder said, there is a human nature. Therefore, it follows that there are natural rights, that is, rights that are important to the flourishing of people of our human natures. And that third, being natural, they precede government. In Randy Barnett's phrase, first comes rights, then comes government. Woodrow Wilson's attack was thorough. He said, first of all, human nature is a fiction, that we are actually creatures who acquire the impress of whatever culture we're in. Therefore, control of the culture becomes not just a political objective, it becomes the overriding political objective, to control the consciousness of the rising citizenry. When consciousness became a political project in the 19th century, we became, whether we knew it or not, on a path to the great struggle of the 20th century, which is against totalitarianism, which aims to be total so that it can totally shape the consciousness. So Woodrow Wilson says, human nature is a fiction. It is a cultural artifact. Hence, there are no natural rights. Hence, there's no need to have limited government strong enough to defend our rights, but not too strong so that it threatens our rights. Therefore, fourth point, said Wilson, the doctrine of the separation of powers is pointless because it gives us hobbled government, and government has this great and stately jurisdiction to shape our consciousness and make us worthy creatures. And therefore, we must get rid of the separation of powers. And fifth, the consequence of that is we must have a plebiscitary president. That is, a president who can intuit, interpret, to use Woodrow Wilson's phrase, the mood of the country and translate it into policy as directly as possible. None of this nonsense about filtering and refining public opinion that the Federalist Papers are full of. None of this nonsense, as Woodrow Wilson saw out of Madison's desire to slow things down. When the framers went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they did not go to produce what Woodrow Wilson wanted, an efficient, nimble government. The idea would have horrified them. What they wanted was a government safe, a government competent to its duties, as the Articles of Confederation weren't, but Again, not so strong and nimble as to slip a firm constitutional leash, to which end the framers in Philadelphia devised a government with three branches of government, two branches of the legislative branch with their own electoral rhythms and constituencies, vetoes, veto overrides, judicial review, supermajorities, all kinds of ways to slow things down, not to prevent action. I can think of nothing in American history that the American people have wanted intensely and protractedly that they did not get from a reasonably responsive political system, but they often had to wait, and they often had to compromise, and they often had to think it through, and they often had to surmount their own impatience. Too bad.
It strikes me that if Madison were alive today, he might be a game designer. When we think about society as a game, there are two principal threats. There are lateral threats. We're concerned about predatory behavior from our fellow citizens against us. And we also see the vertical threat, the concern about predatory behavior from the state to the individual or majorities to minorities. And so how is it that the constitutional design addresses both of these threats simultaneously?
Well, it requires majorities to be assembled across regions. The Electoral College helps with that. It requires majorities to be produced by legislative bargaining. There's a problem for those of us who believe in limited government with legislative bargaining because it is inherently additive. Someone will say, if you will support my projects A, B, and C, I'll support your projects D, E, and F. And thus government grows. That's a transaction cost of democracy, and there's not much to be done about it. But the most important thing is that the question is, what is America about? Is it about majority rule, or is it about liberty? Majority rule is a process. Liberty is a condition. The fundamental argument of my book is that America is about the condition, not the process. I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, Champaign County Courthouse, a big red sandstone thing in Urbana, Illinois, is, according to local lore, where Abraham Lincoln was. He was a very prosperous lawyer traveling the state, when he learned that Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator, had succeeded in passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln's recoil against the Kansas-Nebraska Act was what propelled him to greatness. The Kansas-Nebraska Act said, we're going to solve the vexing problem of what to do about the question of slavery in the territories, such as Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. Stephen A. Douglas said, here's what we'll solve it. We'll vote on it. Vote it up, vote it down. Popular sovereignty is what's important. The outcome's less important. It's a matter of moral indifference to me, but because America is about majorities having their way. Lincoln said, nope, that's not what America's about. America's about liberty, and majorities can be problems, particularly if they are translated directly into policy on the fallacy of vox populi vox dei, that the voice of the God is heard through the voice of the people. Lincoln knew better, as did John Marshall, because to me, one of the great, arguably the greatest American contribution to governance is judicial review, which of course is not mentioned in the Constitution. But it's why I believe that the most important American never to have been president was John Marshall. Probably my top four would be Lincoln, Washington, John Marshall, Franklin Roosevelt. People say, well, judicial review poses the counter-majoritarian difficulty, to which my kind of conservatism says, what's the difficulty? A constitution is inherently counter-majoritarian. It says, this is the way you have to do things, even if you don't want to. And there are certain things that you may want to do that you can't do. First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law. Didn't need to say, but it could have said, Congress shall make no law, even if you wanted to, even if a clamorous majority is clamoring for it. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, the press, assembly, redress of grievance, all the rest. Constitutions are ways of putting bridles on ourselves and saying, no, we're going to voluntarily restrain our freedom of action because, to repeat, majority rule is not our fundamental value. The protection of liberty is, and majorities can threaten liberty.
Now I'm going to make a confession to you. I have not read your PhD dissertation, but I'm guessing that you haven't read mine either. So I think we're even on that score. But your title of your dissertation at Princeton was Beyond the Reach of Majorities, Closed Questions in an Open Society. Is this the point that you were getting at, that you were just describing, that there are some things that are just closed questions in a free society?
Yes, the closed questions are the defense of natural rights. We'll argue what our natural rights are. If you don't like to argue, you pick the wrong country, because we must argue about these things all the time. But the phrase beyond the reach of majorities comes from the second of the flag salute cases, West Virginia v. Barnett. The first flag salute case in 1939, with war clouds lowering over Europe and a great desire for Americans to feel national unity. The Supreme Court held that the state of Pennsylvania had a right to compel Jehovah's Witnesses' children to salute the flag, which they considered blasphemies. Just 4 years later, the Supreme Court reversed that. Now, that 39 opinion was written by a Jewish emigre from Austria, Felix Frankfurter, who had seen Jewish children treated differently and invidiously, and he didn't want other people treated differently, didn't want that. So he had a good reason for coming to, I think, the wrong conclusion. In West Virginia v. Barnett, just 4 years later, the Supreme Court reversed itself. And Justice Jackson, who later would head the American judicial coterie at the Nuremberg War Crimes trial, Justice Jackson said, the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, beyond the vicissitudes of politics. They are closed questions. And that, to me, gives the judiciary in the United States, particularly, of course, the Supreme Court, a permanent engagement in the supervision of democracy and supervising the majority rule that we are committed to, with limits. And it is part of the court's duty to define those limits. And often, when the court says, well, we're going to defer to the legislative, the popular branches of government, that is deference, but it is also a dereliction of duty. That's been one of the great arguments on the conservative side. Actually, many of the most interesting arguments of our time are not between progressives and conservatives. They're between one brand of conservative and another. And for many years, in recoiling against the activism of the Warren Court, particularly in criminal justice matters, conservatives said, we're for judicial deference to the popular branches. Today, the, I hope, ascendant position on the right is, no, we're not. We are in favor of judicial engagement, actively policing the borders of permissible majority rule.
So this is a book about ideas, and you know, this is the Institute for Humane Studies is all about ideas, and not just because of the fact that you know, hanging out with really smart people and dwelling in the world of ideas is fun, which it is, but also because ideas have consequences. The ideas we hold in our heads, the ideas that shape our public discourse and policy discourse shape the world. And so I want to dive more deeply into Wilson's ideas here. You know, it's not always the case that the ideas that have consequences are good consequences. So can you talk a little bit about how you see the consequences of Wilsonian progressivism in our context today? How does that filter through society as we go decade by decade?
Well, as I said earlier, progressivism comes out of the 19th century, which decided that consciousness was a political project, that therefore comprehensive government, eventually became totalitarian government, was necessary, and that emphatic, nimble government was necessary because of one of Woodrow Wilson's great non sequiturs. He said the following: limited Madisonian government was just fine as long as there are only 4 million Americans, 80% of whom live within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater on the fringe of an unexplored continent. But, said Wilson, and here's the non sequitur, he said, now that we are a great continental power, a nation united by steel rails and copper wires, complex, fast-moving society, now we need a government commensurate in size and scope with the dynamism of the American economy. It's, of course, exactly wrong. The more complex society gets, the more government should step back and let the dynamism work and understand, A, the dynamism should work because it's creative, but B, what's the alternative? The alternative is government in the grip of the fatal conceit that it can do more and know more than it actually can. That is the way to folly and waste and inefficiency, and in the end, oppressive government. So for that reason, you might say, well, gee, what's the appeal of progressivism? Well, first of all, progress. You say, yeah, I'm for progress, aren't you? There comes with that the assumption, and it's no more than an assumption, that social change is inevitably improvement. In one of his opinions, this was having to do with capital punishment, Chief Justice Earl Warren talked about the evolving standards of decency that mark the change of a mature society. Now, that indeed, there are evolving standards of decency, and they often are improvements. They are not, however, necessarily improvements. And it's what part of progressivism's appeal is that it gives people the sense that they are, drum roll here, another 19th century phrase, that they are on the right side of history. History with a capital H, history as a proper noun, history as an autonomous force with its own teleology, it knows where it's going, and it's best to get on the right side of it, or you'll either be left behind or trampled. So the appeal of progressivism is progress is good, I want to be on the right side of history, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that once you sever rights from a fixed view of human nature, to which end I would recommend President Calvin Coolidge's magnificent talk on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Once you sever the idea of rights from that, then rights become dispensations from the government. They are zones of autonomy that the government grants to us, that the government agrees to respect as part of a bargain. We'll grant you these spaces of autonomy so long as you enjoin your rights, exercise them in a way that the government deems socially beneficial. That's simply not the definition of a free society as I understand it.
So let me push back on this point about the progressives are putting forward a notion of human nature that we are perfectible, and that the human nature is plastic in this sense, and the conservative sensibility pushes back against that notion. That goes that goes along with the point that when we talk about transformation, social transformation, that's problematic because it's not taking into consideration this sort of permanence of human nature, and that's the argument that you lay out in the book. So the challenge I have to that is that well, does that mean that we should not expect progress? Does that mean that the project that the founders laid out is not an optimistic project? And I would say that, in fact, it is an optimistic project, that there was not a sense of which we've got it all right now. We've got everything perfect now. In fact, there were many things that were highly imperfect in the founding, but it established a sort of baseline, a kind of platform for improvement. And that if we think about the liberal project, broadly understood as individual liberty, a focus on constitutionally constrained government, economic freedom. If we think of that as the liberal project, there is an optimism in liberalism. Right. And the way you're describing the conservative sensibility, it might seem as if it's opposed to that optimism. Is it?
No, it's wary optimism. Indeed, they were optimists. They were creatures of, products of, and enthusiasts for the Enlightenment. That is, the belief that knowledge was cumulative, ever expanding, and applicable to society's problems. The framers of our Constitution included an amendment provision because they said, we didn't get it all right, and we're going to have to adjust this. I mean, think about it. They didn't need to put an amendment provision in. They could have said, we got it right, and that's that, live with this. But they understood that things were imperfect, including their own handiwork. But when I say wary optimism, there are lots of ways things can go wrong. Bad leaders can arise. Great statesmen will not always be at the helm, said James Madison, and what something of maybe an epic-making understatement. So they were wary about the fact that although they had done their level best to provide institutional guardrails, to use a phrase you used a moment ago, against people driving the national wagon off the road, couldn't count on it. Hence an impeachment provision. There are all kinds of ways in which their realism came through. But remember the great catechism of the founders. It went something like this. It's the Madisonian catechism. What is the worst outcome of politics? Tyranny. To what form of tyranny are democracies prey? Tyranny of the majority. Solution, Madison's solution, don't have majorities. That is, don't have stable, potentially tyrannical majorities. Have shifting, complicated coalitions of minorities that produce evanescent majorities that won't last long enough to be forever durable and oppressive. Hence, he said in the Madisonian Revolution and democratic theory was, before Madison, everyone who thought democracy was possible, and there weren't that many, said it's only possible in a small face-to-face society like Rousseau's Geneva or Pericles' Athens. You could walk across it in a day because a small homogeneous polity like that will not have factions, and factions are the enemy of liberty. Madison's exactly wrong, said Madison. A saving multiplicity of factions will produce conditions where you won't have stable tyrannical majorities. Therefore, he says in Federalist 10 about praising an extensive republic, we want to have a large arena for government to protect the different and unequal capacities of acquiring property, because they will be different factions, and the saving multiplicity of factions will save us from tyranny. And in government, he said in Federalist 51, and if you want to have a very short crash course in American political thinking, read those two, Federalist 10 and 51. And 51, he says, we see throughout our system of government the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. He did not say we don't need good motives, but we need something to supplement perhaps the absence of good motives. And that would be the separation of powers and the rivalrous relationship between the branches of government, which he thought was wholesome, the absence of which today, in my judgment, is most unwholesome. The fact that the Congress, the president's party in Congress views itself, that faction, as loyal not to their institution with its dignity and its own rights and responsibilities, but as people who do the blocking and tackling for the president, which is the Madisonian, a dissolution of the Madisonian assumptions.
So let me return to Hayek here for a moment, because there's a parallel of the rivalrousness in Hayek's thinking as well. And you've already alluded to his argument about the fatal conceit that if government doesn't have this kind of humility, this epistemic humility about what it's capable of doing, we're going to, march down the road to serfdom. And the emphasis on spontaneous order, that there are these self-correcting mechanisms within, particularly a market society, that Hayek describes as part of the ordering principles of a complex society. So you've clearly indicated that Hayek has been helpful to you in this, but Hayek also famously said that he was not a conservative. At the end of the Constitution of Liberty, he writes this essay that says, "Why I'm not a conservative." So help us understand, help us to square that that disjuncture between what Hayek said of himself, but you're wanting to claim him for the conservative sensibility in that intellectual tradition?
I think what Hayek said, he just left a word out. I am not a European conservative. I think he wrote that probably, at least at the University of Chicago, where he was for a while in the Committee on Social Thought. It was published in the English language and by the University of Chicago Press at about the time, by the way, that Milton Friedman published Capitalism and Freedom and George Stigler published The Intellectual in the Marketplace, all luminaries at the University of Chicago. Hayek was quite right. He welcomed the world. He welcomed the uncertainties. He welcomed the constant turning of a market society, and therefore was not a conservative as he had in his European context come to understand the term. We just needed to sit down with him and slap an adjective in that. The title of that paragraph would have saved us all a lot of trouble if he just said, I'm not a European conservative. Then he could have gone and said, look, I'm an American conservative. They're really classic liberals. Fine, no argument.
So in your description of welcoming the world, you are clearly not cleaving to the past. You are embracing that sort of Hayekian sensibility that there is something optimistic about the openness of our future, and that this is something that the conservative sensibility embraces. And it causes me to ask this question: is the conservative sensibility a project about description or a project about aspiration? Because I think that if I look out into the world and I were to do an ethnography of conservatives, most of them would have some sort of idealized view of the past that they want to cleave to and reassert as the direction we ought to go, or to at least put the brakes on away from that past. And so my question is, does this distinguish you from your peers, from your conservative peers, in a substantive way? And if so, provide the defense as to why conservatism really does have this intellectual grounding in welcoming the world.
It has a conservative grounding, first of all, in the founding. That is, in the premises about natural rights, rights essential to the flourishing of people with our kinds of stable, unchanging natures. In that sense, the conservative sensibility is firmly rooted in the past. Now, Margaret Thatcher famously said that European nations were made by history, the United States was made by ideas, which the Institute of Humane Studies is all about. And the ideas we're all about are the ideas at the basis of classic liberalism, that the individual is real, the individual has agency, he's not a mere reflection of society or a plaything of history. And the flourishing of the individual is the objective of government. So the conservative sensibility is rooted in the past, not only indifferent to the past, but rooted in it. Takes its bearings from something that happened almost 250 years ago. And therefore, the conservative sensibility is prescriptive on the basis of the past. It says we know certain things. You know, one of the interesting things about the Constitution is it says there'll be no establishment of religion because we don't know what the truth about religion is. But there's a guarantee clause in the Constitution. You're all guaranteed a Republican form of government because they said we don't know enough about religion, but we know firmly enough about governance to know that a republic, meaning representation and all the rest, is to be guaranteed. So they were perfectly capable of confidence.
So I want to turn to the conversations that are really shaping the course of our current century. And liberalism is under attack. It's being critiqued from the left and the right. And by liberalism, in this sense, I mean the founding principles that we've just been describing: individual liberty, the rule of law, constrained democratic institutions, economic freedom. So if that's the liberal project, it is the recipient of critique from both the left and the right. On the right, we have a sense of let's start there with a sense of wanting to reassert a notion of the common good, and with an advocacy for using the levers of government to, like, industrial policy, restraints on trade, more paternalistic social policy, to achieve or to reassert that right of center notion of the common good. Is this part of the conservative sensibility? If it is, how do we reconcile that? Or is it something that we need to resist if we're on board with the conservative sensibility as you described it?
Resist. People who say, well, I'm a conservative, except that we need to say I'm a common good conservative. You have to say, well, what is it about conservatism, as I outlined it in the conservative sensibility, doesn't accommodate the common good? The common good I'm talking about is what emerges from the spontaneous order of freely contracting individuals cooperating together in society. That's common, and they think it's good because that's what they're trying to produce by voluntary action together. No, the advocates of common good conservatism say, no, the market doesn't really do it. We know what the common good really is. That is to say, we are going to use the government to impose a common good because we think the spontaneous order of society doesn't get there. And what that inevitably involves is a sentimental view of government. That is, government as a disinterested arbiter with no interests of its own, that government is not a faction, among others, to use Madison's favorite word, faction, but also that government is uniquely benign, that it is uniquely, as I say, disinterested. What the common good conservatives need is a seminar on public choice theory. They need to be acquainted with Professor Buchanan's essay against the sentimental view of government, the romantic view of government. Where he said, understand government has its own motives, its own interests. You know, I'll give you an example. It seems to me Elizabeth Warren has a firm grip on half of a point. Elizabeth Warren says, isn't it something wrong with the fact that 5 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States by per capita income are in the Washington area? Washington has no natural resources, doesn't make anything but laws and regulations and trouble. Why does it get so rich? Well, she's right, good question. The answer is that trillions of dollars slosh through government, and it attracts people the way a picnic attracts ants. Therefore, it becomes the plaything of interest groups because the government can't leave well enough alone. It can't leave the society to its spontaneous order. It has to come in and say, no, we're going to correct the way society sorts these questions out. We're going to impose a common good. The problem is, this is the part that Elizabeth Warren and other progressives do not understand, and neither do the common good conservatives, is that government inevitably becomes the plaything of factions. That is, it becomes the plaything of those who can understand the opaque pulleys and levers and processes of a complicated modern state. Now, the people who can understand that are going to be wealthy, confident, articulate, educated, and well-lawyered. And they will know how to manipulate the government. That's why, more often than not, the government redistributes wealth upward, because it is responding to people who are already wealthy.
And we have then a somewhat surprising phenomenon where the arguments for industrial policy on the right are almost identical to the policies favoring industrial policy and top-down government control over the economy on the left.
Yes, the people advocating industrial policy from the right, common good conservatives, say, well, globalization's been hard on manufacturing. Never mind the fact that manufacturing as a percentage of our gross national product's been remarkably stable for some while now. It is the fact that it now takes 1 man hour to make a ton of steel rather than 10 man hours because of productivity improvement. Never mind that all that. The common good conservatives say we need industrial policy because we just know, and here, first departure from epistemic humility, we just know, A, how many people ought to be in manufacturing, what percentage of our economy it ought to be in. This, of course, is inevitably a bias in favor of the status quo, a bias in favor of existing economic entities. It's there, it should exist forever. It's there, protect them against imports and competition from abroad. It's there, it should always be there. I would like to send my common good conservative friends to where my family came from, the Monongahela Valley of Pennsylvania. Ground zero for the steel industry that was established for a while and then got obliterated by more efficient competition. The common good conservatives say, well, we're going to conserve the Monongahela Valley. We're going to rebuild it. We're going to bring the jobs back. No, you're not. What these people need to be acquainted with is Grapes of Wrath, the Great Depression era novel by John Steinbeck. When Oklahoma was hit by the double whammy of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, the Joad family of his novel did not just sit there. They got in their jalopy and went to Southern California, and arriving about in time, as it turned out, to work in the aerospace industry in Southern California. That's what happens in a free society, is you move around, geographical mobility. You don't try and freeze the present, because that way is stagnation, that way is the slow leaching away of American dynamism, and with it, the possibilities for the constant churning and upward mobility that makes the free society fun.
So before turning over to Q&A, I want to ask also a question that comes from the left in terms of the left's critique of the liberal project, the founding era principles, is that we look around the world and we see unequal treatment under the law, mass incarceration, over-policing of communities of color, disproportionate costs of the drug war borne by those same communities. And I believe that the classical liberal intellectual community and conservatives, as you describe them, need to take these kinds of challenges seriously. And the charge is that the liberal project, from the progressive standpoint, is those founding principles of the Declaration and the Bill of Rights are simply not up to the task of addressing these kinds of concerns. What is the conservative sensibility response to this, or the classical liberal response to this charge?
Which is what better grounding to take on all the defects of our society that you mentioned and that I accept as defects, than a political philosophy grounded in the understanding of the individual as a rights-bearing creature, often threatened by government. First come rights, then comes government. Now, we provide the vocabulary, we classic liberals, we provide the vocabulary to attack qualified immunity for police who get away with sometimes murder and often lesser crimes, but serious crimes. What better to say that a society respectful of rights-bearing individuals would not have the kind of drug war that we have had, that would be less punitive, less eager to punish, less eager to incarcerate, would be less given to the mad proliferation of criminal statutes. Wonderful book written a few years ago by Harvey Silverglate, I believe his name is, called 3 Felonies a Day. The title from the fact that the average American, given this impenetrable web of criminal statutes, probably commits about 3 felonies a day without even knowing it. Who is possibly better equipped by philosophy and by the vocabulary of freedom and rights to address these than conservatives? And indeed, who is making the running in the attempt to get rid of qualified immunity? Conservatives, classic liberal conservatives of the Cato Institute type. So I think, A, we know how to do this, and B, we have nothing in our current posture to be ashamed of.
Thank you for that. And let's turn it over to Brad Jackson again, who's going to be moderating our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you both for a really fascinating conversation. We've had a number of questions come in from the audience. Thank you to the audience for so many wonderful questions. I only wish we had time to be able to get through all of them. I'll be trying to group some of the common themes together and hope to address as many of them as possible. I'm going to begin with a question for Dr. Will with regard to his own or your own ideological movement over time. So one questioner points out that in your classic book, Statecraft as Soulcraft, there seems to be a very Burkean, Hamiltonian sort of feel to the argument in that book, whereas in the Conservative Sensibility, the heroes seem to be Madison and Hayek. And does this represent a shift in your thinking? And if so, could you describe how that occurred? And if not, could you talk a little bit about the ways in which these things are actually coherent with one another?
Yeah, I'm so glad that someone's read Statecraft as Soulcraft. I refer to it in my book as my new book as read by dozens. They came out of the Godkin lectures I gave at Harvard in 1981. Yes, there's been some change. Since then, I have lived in Washington for 40 years. And I have a more jaundiced, more Buchananite, if you will, choice theory view of the dynamics of government. So yes, I have less confidence in the Hamiltonian project. I also understand better than I did then that the American people suffer from cognitive dissonance. That is, they hold their mind with equal fervor and sincerity, flatly incompatible ideas. They are ideological Jeffersonians and operational Hamiltonians, and it's a problem. That said, there's less change than some people say between the Conservative Sensibility and the Statecraft as Soulcraft in this particular. The subtitle of Statecraft as Soulcraft is what government does, not what government should do, what government can't help but doing. Any government will favor certain values and will, by the structure of its laws and its education system and its economic arrangements, will produce certain kind of soulcraft. So we have a choice here. But I did not realize the Conservative Sensibility didn't abandon that soulcraft dimension of conservatism. It makes a correction from statecraft to soulcraft in that I did not sufficiently understand that capitalism is soulcraft. That is, capitalism doesn't just make us better off, which it manifestly does, it makes us better. It does so by requiring politeness, by requiring cooperation, by requiring spontaneous order, by enforcing certain virtues, thrift, industriousness, deferral of gratification. So capitalism, and I do this at length in my chapter on political economy and the Conservative Sensibility, capitalism is soulcraft. Therefore, the American founding was better than I suggested in Statecraft or Soulcraft because the American founding presupposed a market society.
Thank you. So we've also had a number of folks in the queue asking about your understanding of how conservatism has changed over American history. Folks point out that the conservatism of Taft is remarkably different from the conservatism of Reagan, and they wonder how a movement that seeks to conserve a set of fundamental truths could itself change so much over time, and whether you could talk about the dynamism of the conservative movement and what that means for it as a conservatism. And as a sort of add-on to this question, could you say a little bit about the current Republican Party and Trumpism as a sort of conservatism, whether it is a sort of conservatism and how it fits into this picture?
No, the current Republican Party, to the extent that it's a political party at all. It's hard to have a political party where the elected officials of which are terrified of their voters, which is the way it is now. The current political party is populist, and whatever populism is, conservatism isn't. Populism is, again, Wilsonian in that it wants the direct, immediate translation into policy of strongly held passions on the part of the country. Conservatives believe passion is a problem, and government exists not to excite passions, but to damp them down. and deflect them and slow down their course. So I've answered the last part of your thought first. I, in 1960, was an undergraduate in college, and I supported Jack Kennedy and was just sort of normal walking around guy. And in 62, I went to Oxford for 2 years, saw the Berlin Wall, which was new then, and saw what I thought was socialism suffocating the energies of a great nation, the United Kingdom, and came back and voted for Goldwater. Now, cast my first presidential vote in 1964 for Barry Goldwater, who had that Southwest wide open spaces, leave me alone kind of libertarian conservatism. So in that sense, I haven't changed all that much. I'd vote for Barry again in a heartbeat. Conservatism has faced some temptations. The temptations posed by globalization and the fact that creative destruction is often creative, but often destruction. And there's frictions and pain involved. And there is a desire on the part of some conservatives to stop it, to flinch from change. Say, well, it's too tiresome. It's wearying. It was all right once, but enough. We want stasis. It's more restful. Well, conservatism is many things. It should not be a restful society. It should be a dynamic society full of people going up and down the status ladder. So in that sense, I think conservatism today still is largely what Barry and I had in mind in 1964, that Reagan more or less had in mind in 1980. And departures from it toward collectivism and statism are departures from conservatism.
Thank you very much. So this is related to another question that I thought was really interesting from the audience, which is, how does a conservative decide what not to conserve in a dynamic society?
Mm-hmm.
You know, some things have to be left behind through the process of creative destruction. And how do we most responsibly decide what those things are? How do we distinguish between the baby and the bathwater?
Well, the baby, for example, is family structure. We know, because abundant social science tells us that family structure is the great predictor of life chances. I speak now as someone whose best friend was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, as a 38-year-old academic in Lyndon Johnson's Labor Department, produced the Moynihan Report, which first raised the problem of family disintegration, particularly among African Americans. We know that we want to be a society that enforces equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome and condition, but, and this is the heart of my book in many ways, conservatives have had to come to terms with the fact that equality of opportunity is a more complicated and elusive goal than we realize. It's not a slogan, it's a difficult thing to achieve, particularly when family structure, family is always the primary transmitter of social capital, the habits, mores, customs, dispositions necessary for flourishing in an open society. So conservatives rightly worry about policies to strengthen families. Hence, conservatives today are arguing about paid family leave, about child tax credits. And at this point, it's an empirical argument. Conservatives don't say, no, we're against those because it's government doing something. Conservatives say, well, prove to me, show me, give me some data. Let's be empiricists about this. Will it work? We know that the transition between policy to actuality is often a messy and disappointing thing in government, but try it, yeah. If you want social mobility, you want the Jodes to get up and move, if you want the people in the Mon Valley of Pennsylvania to move, help them move. Give them new training if government knows the future that it's training for. That's always a problem with government. Government will say, yeah, we're going to train you for this industry over here. Wait a minute. That's not, you got to look over the horizon, and government is notoriously bad at looking over the horizon.
Let me jump in here, if I may, Brad. the shift in the gay rights movement to marriage equality was a case, I think, where there was a kind of conservativization of the movement in this regard. And some people would, say that them's fighting words for me to say that, but in the spirit that you've just described, the things that we want to conserve would be things like family structure. And this is a community that says, we want what you have, which is essentially that same family structure. And that shifted the balance, I think, in terms of public opinion, a very fast move in favor of gay rights on this, at least on this front. And it was pivotal, because then it became not just some other group that was way far away from your own direct experience. It was your neighbor, or it was your cousin or your sister, whose family was trying to just have the same rights as your family has. Is this an example of that kind of sorting that can upset usual political divisive points of division?
Yes, indeed. I don't want to embarrass my friend Jonathan Rausch of the Brookings Institution by calling him a conservative, but or by saying that what he really advocated is probably the most forceful and sophisticated advocate of same-sex marriage, bourgeois values. But he is a conservative, and he was promoting bourgeois values. And welcome to the club. That's exactly right. The marriage equality movement triumphed when and because of its transition to a vocabulary, if you will, of conservatism.
So some folks in the audience who have read and enjoyed your book noticed that in the second chapter of it, you talk a lot about progressivism, Wilson, Crowley, and these figures in order to talk about some of the difficulties that have faced American constitutionalism in the 20th and 21st centuries. But they wonder if you would distinguish or not between progressivism and what some have called modern liberalism. Thinking of the sort of liberalism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or the way in which liberalism has been used in the American context throughout the 20th century. Do you make a distinction between progressivism and so-called modern liberalism, or do you think that modern liberalism is an abuse of the term liberalism?
Not much. Franklin Roosevelt came to Washington to be the assistant secretary for Woodrow Wilson. He was a progressive. Now, he was also a great fidgeter, he had, as Amity Shlaes says in one of her books, the restlessness of the invalid. He wanted to fiddle with things, which is fine. It's kind of, you could understand the impulse in 1933. That said, the progressive agenda is an agenda to multiply dependent factions, those factions dependent on government. And Roosevelt set out to make organized labor organized, and therefore a democratic faction. The elderly with Social Security became a faction. The birth of modern agricultural policy made farmers a government-dependent faction. This was done deliberately. It was a strategy for a permanent majority. Permanent majorities have a way in the United States of being impermanent, but it wasn't for want of trying on the part of Franklin Roosevelt. So to the extent that progressivism understands equality as equal dependence on government of various factions, I would say Franklin Roosevelt was well in the progressive tradition.
So when you were talking about the need for elites in society, some folks in the questions were wondering if you could expound a little bit about that, particularly within the context of the question of the franchise. So some folks argue that if you want better elites, you need better voters. And so we should restrict the franchise somehow to create an epistocracy, sometimes the term is used. And indeed, if you look at the history of the conservative movement in the US, it seems as though some factions were against women's suffrage and extending the franchise in other ways. So could you say something about the relationship as you see it between democracy and the conservative sensibility?
Well, we always need better voters. There's no question. That doesn't mean we need fewer voters. We are committed to adult suffrage. That used to be 21, it's now 18. There's some Democrats who want impulsive adolescents at age 16 to vote, but we'll leave that aside. To speak for elites, I would recommend a book called The Wise Men. It's by, gosh, I'm drawing a blank right now, but it was Evan Thomas, and it'll come to me in a minute. It's about the elites who took America through the Second World War. I'm talking about Chip Bolin, George Kennan, George Marshall, John McCloy, people like this. They had something in common, and this will grate on some people, I'm afraid. There were an awful lot of them from Groton and Yale. Sorry, they just were. And they came from elite institutions that saw it as part of their mission to produce people who would hold elite positions in society, rather than just going to Brown Brothers Harriman. Abraham Harriman was one of them, to coin money. We need not just elites, but we need elite institutions that see as part of their writ the production of people who think of themselves as elite. Again, Kennan, Bolin, Harriman, McCloy, people like this, who turns out every once in a while it's really handy to have elites like that around.
I'm just going to ask one more quick question before turning it over to Emily to close us out. And that was an audience member who was wondering if you could recommend 2 or 3 books that you think are particularly important for Americans to read.
Oh, gosh. We'll leave aside Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers and all the rest. The Radicalism of the American Revolution by Gordon Wood. The Ideological Origins by Bernard Bailyn. Crisis of the House Divided by Harry Jaffa. And I'm going to give you one right out of left field. You're going to say, what is the matter with Will now? It's called Last Call by Daniel Okrent. It's a history of prohibition. It is it's history as it ought to be written. Page turner, exciting. And it is on every page an illustration of the law of unintended consequences, of government just getting out of its lane, not recognizing its limits, causing all kinds of changes. I mean, better speedboats because the rum runners were outrunning the feds. Las Vegas was a result of, I mean, just all kinds of things happened. It's a great case study in how to, again, a sensibility. Again, I don't want to cause Daniel Okrent trouble. I'm not calling him a conservative, but I'm saying that a lot of what the conservative sensibility is about can be learned by reading that one book.
Well, George, Will, thank you for today's conversation. I also want to thank our audience. More than 500 people joined us for today's conversation. And if you haven't already read The Conservative Sensibility, I hope that today's conversation has convinced you to pick up a copy and to read it. It is, after all, summer reading season upon us. In closing, I note that the Institute for Humane Studies hosts conversations like this through our Discourse Initiative, which aims to draw scholarly attention back to the grand intellectual tradition of liberalism. You can learn more at theihs.org. Thank you again, George, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Be well.